I've explained that in the book of John, he has 7 types of long conversation, or 7 long conversations. And let's recap. First of all, with John the Baptist. Now, John the Baptist, he was somebody who came to proclaim that Jesus was God. And Jesus had a certain type of conversation with him. Secondly, it was the disciples. I'll just get rid of that wire. The disciples, people who had already chosen to follow Jesus. He has some long conversations with them. Nicodemus, you might remember, was one particular man, a Pharisee, who wanted to know how to get to heaven. Jesus explained how to be born again. Then he had a long conversation with a woman at the well, and she had some questions about worship, and we learned a lot about worship through that conversation. Several times we see he has conversations with the Jewish leaders, people who should have been helping, but actually they made life worse for people. Lastly, last week we were looking at the fact that he sometimes talked to the crowd, and although we didn't say much about it, we talked about the feeding of the 5,000, where he spoke to the crowd, and later on he spoke to them again. And when Jesus speaks to the crowd, his main message is this: follow me. And you might look at those and consider whereabouts you are on that scale. What sort of conversation would Jesus have with you? And then the 7th long conversation that Jesus has is not going to be told to you today. That's in a couple of weeks' time, where we get to the last one. All right, 7 miracles. There are 7 miracles in John. Water into wine. When Jesus turned water into wine, he was showing the power to create. When he cured the nobleman's child, when the child wasn't even there, he'd ratcheted up the miracle a bit. Now he was healing at a distance. Then he showed he could heal on the Sabbath. And when the Pharisees say, you can't heal on the Sabbath, Jesus said, yes, I can, because I am God, and God works on the Sabbath. Last week we were talking about the fact that he fed 5,000 people from 2 fish and 5 loaves. And although we didn't get into the detail last week, this was a really significant miracle to the Jewish people, because they would talk about the fact that in the wilderness, when they left Egypt and they were going to the promised land, they used to say, Moses gave us bread, which wasn't true. It was God who gave them the food. But just out of 2 fish and 5 loaves, Jesus had the power to create enough food for 5,000 men, plus women and children. And he goes on in chapter 8 to talk about the fact that there is one greater than Moses, able to be there in front of them. And then, we just mentioned it very briefly, we've talked about the walking on water and calming the storm. We've done a talk on that a couple of times in the last few years, which is why we've missed it this time. But Jesus was able to walk on water. When the storm was raging, he spoke to the storm, and the winds and the waves calmed down, revealing he had power over nature. John has gradually been revealing things about Jesus by which miracles he's talking about. And today, we get to the man born blind that he heals. And then next week, we get to the 7th miracle, which is, well, it's next week, isn't it? So I'm not going to tell you now. Read ahead if you want, chapters 10 and 11. The man born blind was healed. Why is this one of the 7 miracles John wants to talk about? He's only going to talk about 7 in the book. He says he saw more miracles than you could even write down in all the books in the world. Of course, there's more books now, but in that day there were fewer books. But that's how many miracles he saw, but only 7 did he write about. Why did God tell him to write about this one? Okay. Well, maybe because no one had ever healed a person who was blind from birth before. There were other examples of healing. In fact, Jesus had even healed other blind people earlier on, but not someone who had never, ever been able to see in their entire life. It is another scale up on how amazing the miracle was. Maybe it's something to do with challenging the Pharisees again, because this is a theme that you see a lot in John. He healed on the Sabbath. We might think, what was this business about spitting on the floor and making clay? Why did Jesus do that? Well, maybe it's because you're not allowed to make clay on a Sabbath day. You might remember I told you a few weeks ago when we talked about Nicodemus, one of the things you were not allowed to do was spit onto soil. You could spit onto stone because that didn't turn into anything useful. But if you spit onto mud, you could make a mortar out of it, which is useful. So it wasn't allowed. So maybe that's why Jesus deliberately did that, just to wind up the Pharisees. Maybe it's because in Genesis, when God is making mankind, it says he took the clay, he took the ground and used that to form humanity. And maybe Jesus is harking back to that. So those are possible reasons why this is an important miracle. But actually, I think the main reason, and what I'm going to talk about today, is sin and suffering. Sin and suffering. This is not the first time that John has spoken about sin and suffering. We didn't mention it at the time, but in John 5, he healed the crippled man by the pool. And afterwards he said, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you." He warned the man not to sin, because there could be something bad happen. In John 8, there is the story of the woman caught in adultery. And what happens is a woman is caught, and she's married, and she's with a man who is married, but they're not married to each other. And they catch her. Of course, they must have caught him as well. And they bring her, leave him for some reason, bring her to Jesus. So we could ask for a start, why did they not bring the man? They said, the law says if someone is caught committing adultery, we must stone them. We must take the stones, throw the stones at them until they are dead, Jesus. So isn't that what we should do to this woman? And you've got to ask yourself, well, who was the man? Who was the man that the law did not apply to him? And the answer is, sadly, we see it often, women and men are not treated the same. And a harsher law or a harsher attitude is applied to women, and it's not right. The Bible says it's not right. This is just another example where the man should have been there. But either way, the woman was there. And they're testing Jesus. Oh, Jesus, you're so loving. The law says we must kill this woman. What do you say? And they thought they'd trapped him. But he says something very clever. He says, any one of you who has never done something wrong in your life, you can start the stoning. And then the rest of us will join in. But only somebody who has no sin can throw the first stone. And then, as the picture shows, he started just doodling in the sand. And the people looked at each other, and they knew each other. And they knew that every single one of them had sinned. And gradually, one by one, they walked away. And the woman eventually was left, just her and Jesus. Now the thing is, Jesus had no sin. Jesus had never done anything wrong. So he could have taken the first stone. But he didn't. He said, so where are the people who are accusing you? And she says, well, they've all gone. And he says, well, they don't accuse you, and I don't condemn you either. I don't condemn you. Go and sin no more. So he forgives her for a sin, but he's not saying it doesn't matter. He says, but stop doing the wrong thing that you're doing. Forgiveness does not mean it's okay to sin. We know as Christians we are forgiven when we confess our sin to God. But that does not mean that we should be sinning and saying, it doesn't matter, I'll be forgiven. So, this is what John has already said about sin before we get to chapter 9. And then we get to chapter 9, and the disciples begin by saying, this man is suffering. Is it his sin, or is it his parents' sin? And Jesus takes the chance to say, right, let me talk about sin and suffering. It's interesting, this attitude of the disciples, an assumption that the man must have done something wrong. The Pharisees thought it too. In John 9:34, the Pharisees said to him, you were completely born in sins, and you were teaching us, and they cast him out. Do you know, a great bit of the story is that after they cast him out, Jesus went and found him again and spoke to him. But people in that time assumed that if you'd done something wrong, it caused suffering. And if you were suffering, it's because you'd done something wrong. And you can read this in the book of Job, where Job is suffering, and all the people who come to him are talking about the fact, it's because, Job, you've done something wrong. That's why God is punishing you. Is suffering caused by sin? That is a fundamental question, is it? We see suffering in the world, don't we? We see things going wrong in the world. Is it caused by sin? And the answer is yes and no. Okay? Yes and no. All right, let me explain why the answer is both yes and no. Sin hurts people. I've said it before, you'll hear me say it again. Sin hurts people. God hates sin because when we sin, it results in someone getting hurt. So, for example, if you steal something, someone loses. If I were to steal something from you, you have suffered a loss. Of course, if I get caught stealing, I get punished. So then I get a loss as well. So theft on either side causes suffering. If you're a person who gets angry or jealous, that's going to affect your relationships. Your relationship will suffer if you have a personality where you're getting angry with people, or if you're jealous of people. That's just some simple examples. But we know that when we do something wrong, it results in someone getting hurt. In Galatians 6:7, it says, do not be misled. You cannot mock the justice of God. You harvest what you plant. Or the more traditional amongst might say, you reap what you sow. You can't get away from this fact. If you do the right thing, then over time, it will result in good things happening. If you do the wrong thing, over time, it will result in bad things happening. And you can't get away from that. It won't be instant, but it will happen. That's the way that the world works. That's the way the world is set up. You end up harvesting what you plant. Sometimes people have come to me, often men, saying, pray that I would have a good marriage. I want you to pray that I would have a good relationship with my wife. And I say, okay, I will pray for that. But before I pray for that, let me tell you something more important. You will reap what you sow. If you are good to your wife, if you are kind to your wife, if you help your wife, if you provide for your wife, then you'll have a good relationship. And if you're cruel to your wife and you expect her to work hard while you don't, if you hit your wife, if you shout at your wife, then it does not matter how much I pray, you will have a lousy relationship with your wife. So it's all very well you come asking me to pray to help your marriage, but you know what? Prayer is not what helps a marriage. It is our actions that affect our marriage. So, if within your marriage you do not follow the advice that God gives us in the Bible about a good marriage, do you know what will happen? You'll end up with a bad marriage. Not because you're cursed, but because simply you have harvested what you planted. So of course, sin does cause suffering. But we know the man was not blind because of sin. Jesus specifically said, this man did nothing wrong, his parents did nothing wrong. That's not what caused the suffering. So you can't assume that if you see suffering, someone must have sinned. Sometimes suffering happens because suffering happens. That is the world we live in. We live in a world where things go wrong. Illness. We have viruses, bacteria, all these kinds of things that can cause illness. Accidents can happen. There was a time when a tower fell down and some people died. And Jesus said, those people who died in that tower falling down, do you think they were sinners? Do you think God made the tower fall down because those were evil people? No, it was just an accident. It happens. We have disasters. Goodness me, we know about disasters at the moment with the earthquake on the border of Turkey and Syria. These are not caused by sin. Suffering sometimes just happens. Jesus said, this is why we live in a world where a man can be born blind. Neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. I must work the works of him who sent me while it's day. The night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Why does God allow there to be a place where there can be suffering? And I would say, so you can see the difference between good and evil. If God had made a world where there was no such thing as suffering, what would good be? How could I do good to someone if they could not suffer? If no one ever got hungry, how could we feed someone? If no one ever got thirsty, how could we give someone a drink? If no one ever hurt, how could we comfort them? God, in his wisdom, created a world knowing that there would be good and evil. Jesus said, I'm the light of the world. He came revealing he was the light of the world. How can you show light if there's no darkness? Okay? If I turn on a light now in this room, would you notice it? No, because if everything is light and you add light, there's no difference. But if the world is in darkness and you add light, it is obvious that there is light. How could we understand the goodness of God if there were no such thing as bad? Help and compassion would be meaningless. You would never be able to show a kindness to somebody if there was no suffering, because then how could you be kind to somebody if there was nothing wrong for them? It means our choices would not matter. It wouldn't have any effect. If I choose to help or not help, it doesn't matter, because God will stop the suffering if there is no suffering. So I believe that is why God made a world and allowed suffering to come about. Now notice that I don't say God made a world of suffering, because the Bible doesn't say that. It says the world was perfect when he made it. So what he made was perfect. But We corrupted it through sin. We brought evil into the world. Not got time to talk about the whole thing now, but if we read Genesis, it shows how it all came about. So having light and dark within a world forces us to make a choice. Every person can see what happens in this world, and they can see what happens in Turkey and say, I will ignore that, or I will do something about that. They have a choice. If you see someone who is suffering, will I help? Will I not help? You have a choice. You see goodness, you see evil. There is God, there is the enemy. Who do you choose? And if there were not suffering in the world, how would you make a choice? There would be nothing to choose between, because there would only be good. So there would be no choice. And God wants us to make a conscious choice to follow good. What do we do about this? What is our response? First, do your best not to sin. We know that as Christians, if we sin, God will forgive us. But sin still hurts people. Sin still has consequences. If I were cruel to Hillary, and I was genuinely sorry, and I asked God to forgive me, God would forgive me. But that doesn't put things right between me and Hillary. She would still have lost trust in me. And even saying sorry to her would not fix everything. Sin has consequences. It affects things long term. So never, ever think, my sin doesn't matter because I can be forgiven. Let us try our best not to do things wrong. Secondly, don't judge people. In this story, the disciples were judging the man and his family. And we think, well, we're not like that. I don't see a blind person and think, did he commit a sin to cause his suffering? No, of course we don't do that. But do you ever see a homeless person? Maybe smells of alcohol on his breath. And you think, oh, I know why they are homeless. It's because they have a problem drinking. And because of that, they have spent their money. And now they want help. And you find yourself judging that person. You see someone who's gone to prison and can't get a job, and you just say, well, there you go. You shouldn't have gone to prison. If you hadn't done something wrong and gone to prison, people would give you a job. It's your fault. And we judge people. And we shouldn't. Don't look down on people with problems. Even if they cause those problems through bad choices. Because do you know what? When people make those bad choices, they don't do it on purpose. They don't think, oh, if I take large amounts of alcohol, or if I start taking illegal drugs, I'm going to end up as an addict and homeless. That's not how it works. Sometimes people make bad choices because of the family they grow up in, or because of the people they associate with, or because of the pain of something that's gone wrong, and the only thing that numbs that pain is drink or drugs. So even if they make bad choices, you don't know why they made those bad choices. Jesus had compassion on prostitutes. He didn't say, well, of course society looks down on you. Look what you do for a living. You're disgusting. Why should I have anything to do with you? No. He didn't judge them for the choices that they'd made. In the moment that they were at, Jesus came and forgave them and then tried to show them a better life. Go and sin no more. So don't judge people. Don't look down on them. Lastly, there is suffering in this world. Whether you think my explanation fits or whether you think I've got it wrong, it's up to you. But what I do know is that whenever we see suffering, it is a chance to show God's love. That should be our response to suffering. How do I show God's love in this situation? How do I help? How do I let people know that God cares? Can I do something practical? Can I give them something or help them in some way? A practical thing. Although bear in mind, people don't always know what they need. And I don't give money to people who are begging on the streets. If somebody says they're hungry, then I will go and buy them food. I don't ever give them money because I worry that if I give them money, it won't get spent on food. So when I say help them in practical ways, you sometimes have to be wise about, well, what is the practical way to help this person? So it's not as simple as I just do whatever a person asks me to do. We need to be wise about, well, what do they need? And what can I do that really helps them as opposed to puts them in a worse state? But also pray. One of the things I love about the way we do Food Bank is that people who have a genuine need come in and they get food and we say to them, would you like us to pray for you? Some people like it, we're a church. Some people don't like it, in which case we won't. But would you like us to pray for you? And so many people say, yes. People say, well, I don't really believe in God, but yes, you can pray anyway. Or they say, I don't think anyone's prayed for me in years. Please pray for me. Sometimes we pray for people and they start to cry. As we start to show God's love, as they feel God in that room, they start to cry. Sometimes, recently, in fact, we've had people come back to us and say, your prayer was answered. I asked you to pray for this, and you did, and it happened. And I've come back to tell you that God has answered your prayer. Be practical. But you know what? Praying is an incredibly practical thing to do. Where do you fit in this? Is the most important message to you today about you setting aside your sin? Is the most important message for you today you recognizing that you look down on people and you shouldn't? Or is the most important message for you today that you need to help people, that when you see suffering, you need to do something practical to show God's love? We're going to break bread in a minute, but before we do that, just you talk to God. You pray now about those things, about how you are going to respond.